G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and at the time of recording this on Tuesday the 14th of April 2020, The Guardian reports that Australia has 6,394 confirmed cases of COVID-19 and 62 deaths. It's too early to say, but it does look like the measures Australia has taken appear to be working, which gives us as a country a lot more options than many other countries have at the moment. But not everyone sees it that way. Many commentators and economists think that the restrictions Australia has put in place about public gatherings and effectively shutting down parts of the economy to prevent a public health crisis go too far. Gigi Foster from the ABC's The Economists thought that it was a disgrace that we told young people to stop going to the pub and that Trump was right, that the cure is worse than the disease. John Kehoe from the Financial Review wrote that his 69-year-old father has, quote, had a good run. And Chris Ullman from Nine asks, if a grandparent chooses a loving embrace that may kill them, who are we to stop them? And argues that the effects of quarantining and social distancing are, quote, as life-shattering as any plague.
People have this impression that we're trading off lives against money. It's not lives against money. It's lives against more lives.
You're the only person who has made this point.
Well, there's a point about opportunity cost, right? It's the same problem that people have when they don't understand the basic opportunity cost concept, which is you see what's right in front of you. You see, if I don't spend money, then this older person is going to die. What you don't see is if I spend the money on that older person, I'm not spending it on everybody else and everything else in the economy. And that has a cost. It's just an unseen cost. It's an opportunity cost.
Except that the cost is much more than the older person because of the exponential thread.
Sure, this is just one example. I mean, and it's also not just spending money. It's the whole notion of keeping the economy running, right? And that choice actually saves many, many more lives than the lives that are saved by quarantining, the entire economy and saying, okay, shutdown mode, and let's not let this virus spread. That's what I feel is the case.
That state and federal governments came up with a plan on how to end this lockdown and then told us what it is. It's time to start returning to normal. It's time we were allowed to start rebuilding our...
Ultimately, the goal is to ease the guidelines and open things up. I said earlier today that I hope we can do this by Easter.
The numbers of new cases are small, people are saying, so let's take the foot off the brake now and get the economy back on its feet and people back to work. Well, the first thing to state, and most governments are stating it clearly, the economy won't be fixed until you've fixed the pandemic.
How much does it cost if someone gets sick and dies? I mean,
Sure.
This is not... I think to be even fair to even the government, they've recognised this is now a public health emergency first and foremost.
That means that Australians are making a difference. They are saving lives and protecting lives with their own actions.
So this week I wanted to talk to our chief economist, Richard Dennis, about the value of human life. He's written at least 2 essays on the subject for The Monthly back in 2015 and one from February of 2019. And apologies for the sound quality. Richard recorded this in his car on the side of the highway in the middle of some essential travel. So you can hear some traffic noise in the background in places. G'day, Richard.
How are you?
Great. Now, most people would think that human life is priceless. Is that true?
No. Ask an economist. Look, you can take out a life insurance policy that literally puts a value on a human life. When people have industrial accidents, they're entitled, their families that kill them, their families are entitled to compensation for their death. And indeed, when a construction company takes out insurance for a construction project, an actuary estimates how many people are likely to die on that construction project, estimates how much that each death would be compensated, and in turn, the riskier the construction project, the more expensive the insurance premium would be. So, to be clear, we put a dollar value on human life all the time. We just don't talk about it very much, and we don't put the same value on every human's life, and we value human life quite differently in the emergency ward of a hospital than we do, for example, when we're deciding which drugs to list on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme for a subsidy.
So if economists are asked to put a price on human life, or actuaries, do you know roughly how much that price is at the moment?
Oh, yeah, it depends which one you ask and how much you're paying them. There's an old joke about economists. We answer questions not because we know, but because we were asked. You ask me to put a dollar value on a human life, I can come up with as good a number as any other economist, but no economist, myself included, would put their hand on their heart and say that's the right number. To some extent, all economists would agree that a human life is worth way more than zero, but most of us probably agree it's not worth $1 trillion. So somewhere in between $0 and $1 trillion, we as individuals and we as a community have to come up with a number. And the numbers that we usually come up with look like in Australia, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet publishes a helpful memo on how we should value human life, and they say it's about $195,000 per person per year. But they say, maybe there could be extenuating circumstances, but that's about right.
Well, that's quite sobering to think about, isn't it? There have been a lot of commentators, including some economists, who have been talking about the public health measures that we've enacted going too far, and really bringing up this idea that the cure is worse than the disease when it comes to coronavirus. Now, that's a good soundbite, but is it sound economic advice?
Oh, I don't think so. How much should we have spent over summer trying to protect people from those catastrophic bushfires? How much should Australia spend on a defence force to protect us from the unlikely risk that we might be invaded? There's no right answer to those should questions, and no economist participating in public debate, no economist should allow the public to think that economists can answer those should questions. So it's okay for a particular economist to have an opinion, a personal opinion that says, I think it's a bit excessive, but they've got to be very clear with the public about how they came up with that conclusion. Now, when I, as an economist, look at what's happening in New York at the moment, what's happening in London at the moment, what's happened already in Italy and Spain, if you were to ask me, Richard, could you go put a dollar value on all that pain and suffering, apart from feeling quite squeamish about it, if I were to have a go at it, I know I'd come up with a very, very, very large number, because it's not just the people who died who are affected by this. It's their families, and it's the literally millions of people living in those communities that are a witness to a kind of suffering that is unprecedented, and simultaneously living in fear that could be them or their loved ones that were going to happen. Any economist that thinks they know how to put a dollar value on fear and pain and community distress, well, frankly, I'd say they're kidding themselves. So we can't just look at how many people died, multiply that by a number and say that's the cost of coronavirus. The cost of coronavirus is far larger than the value of the very large number of lives that have been lost.
And just unpacking some of the arguments that we've heard from various commentators and economists, two things stuck out to me. One was the idea of opportunity cost, and the other was the concept of discounting, which you talked about in one of your essays. So opportunity cost, the idea that if I spend money saving an older person from dying, that's money that you can't spend on everybody or anything else in the economy. Is that the right idea about opportunity cost? Am I explaining that right?
Yeah, you're explaining it correctly. And look, to be clear, I think economists' main role in public debate is to remind people that things have opportunity costs. So I don't think it's problematic that some economists have said the opportunity cost of trying to prevent deaths from coronavirus is large, and maybe we should be spending that money on something else. It's a truism. There's no doubt that in choosing to do something, we've given up the opportunity to choose to do something else. But it's a big jump from saying maybe we should have spent this money on some other public health measure to concluding that we would have done that. I mean, there's a guy called Bjorn Lomborg who does a great line in sort of subtly undermining all efforts to tackle climate change, because he just writes endlessly about how instead of tackling climate change, it would probably be more efficient to spend a lot of money on aid improving lives in Africa. It's just when you ask him whether we should spend a lot of money improving lives in Africa, he says, no, that's not a very good idea either. So the opportunity cost of any action should always be considered. But just because there's an opportunity cost to our attempts to protect ourselves from this virus doesn't mean it's a bad idea. I mean, there's an enormous opportunity cost. For example, the $200 billion we're going to spend on submarines. We spend $40 billion a year on a defence force, which, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but no one's tried to invade us for quite some time. As a community, we've decided that having that enormous resource there is kind of handy. Similarly, every time you land at an airport, keep in mind there are some firefighters who are based at that airport 24/7, just in case a plane crashes. We spend a fortune protecting ourselves from unlikely risks. And we don't usually talk about the opportunity cost of the Defence Force. So if we're going to talk about the opportunity cost of protecting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from coronavirus, fine, let's have that conversation. But let's have a very broad conversation about the opportunity cost of all sorts of things that we do.
And Richard, what is discounting?
Well, everyone knows what discounting is. It's putting something on sale and making it cheaper. And that's what we do with human life. So you asked me before, can we put a dollar value on a human life? Yes. That's quite different from can we put the right number on it? But yes, I can put a dollar value on a human life this year. What many economists believe is appropriate is, and I personally don't, but when we put a dollar value on a human life, that's for this year. But how do we value the loss of a life in a year's time, or someone losing their life in 5 years' time, or someone losing their life in 50 years' time? Now, economists have this idea of discounting, which what it really means is discounting the future costs and benefits of something. We think that if things happen in the future, they're not as important as if they happen right now. And as a result, we need to discount the costs and benefits of things that arise in the future. Now, I know that sounds a bit crazy, but it's not always crazy. So let me give you an example. If once upon a time you could put money in the bank and earn interest on it, I don't know if anyone remembers those days, but let's say you could get 5% interest on putting some money in a bank account. If I offered you the choice between $100 now and $100 in the future, you'd be mad to take $100 in a year's time, because you'd be better off taking the money now, sticking it in the bank, and having $105 in a year's time rather than $100 in a year's time. So economists think, look, it's better to get things now, because then it's up to you. You can use them now or you can use them later. So the idea that things are more valuable to people now than they are in the future is not crazy. There's plenty of evidence to support that. There's a famous experiment where, if you say to a kid, here's a marshmallow, and if you can not eat it for a minute, I'll give you 2 marshmallows. Most little kids will eat the marshmallow straight away. They prefer things right now. But just because that's true for marshmallows and dollars in the bank, do we really believe that a human life in 10 years' time is worth a lot less than a human life today? And that Productivity Commission, that Prime Minister and Cabinet memo that I talked about before actually has a little handy table in there that helps you figure out how many people it's okay to kill in the future rather than kill someone today. And that's because we literally discount the value of future lives. And that has enormous ethical and policy consequences, especially for something like climate change. Because if you discount lives saved in the future, you come up with the kind of bizarre conclusion that Australians today shouldn't incur small costs to tackle climate change, because sure, it'll save a lot of lives in the future, but lives in the future aren't worth as much as lives today. Now, that's a fundamental ethical question, not something that I think should be hidden in an economist's spreadsheet.
Indeed. So a couple of other kinds of arguments that have been raised was this idea that it's a political decision to shut things down, basically due to overwhelming public opinion. So, for example, Boris Johnson probably being the most famous one, other than perhaps Donald Trump. The idea of this herd immunity, the idea of letting coronavirus rip and it would get through the population, and that the only reason that he didn't proceed with that was that as a politician, it was untenable for him to preside over the number of deaths that would incur to keep the pubs running. What is a useful way that we can talk to and use economists to help us, and I guess other experts, to help us make these decisions in a democratic way?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and it's a really hard question, and there's no right answer to it, but I think there are better and worse ways to go about it. The first thing I think we need to do is collect the expert advice from the people with the expertise we think is most useful. So we need to ask the health professionals, if we want to let this disease rip, what's that going to look like? What are the likely consequences? Help us understand the consequences of letting it rip. And if we want to shut it down, what would we need to do? How far would we need to go if we wanted to crush the curve in the way that we have in Australia? And then, are there middle options? Is there a middle path we can look for? What might that look like? And if we go looking for that middle path, what are the risks of that? What are the possible benefits of that? So, step one, we've just literally got to ask those with medical expertise, what are the likely consequences of certain courses of action? And then we can ask economists and others, but let's start with economists and say, well, what are the likely costs to individuals, communities, and the economy as a whole of going down certain paths and going down certain paths for certain periods of time? Now, to be clear, no one knows the answer. No one knows the answer to the decimal place, because just like the medical professionals can't be sure, they've never fought this disease before, the economists can't be sure either, because we've never experienced a pandemic like this in a world economy like the one we've built in the last 100 years. So I think we have to get good options for controlling the disease from the health experts, and then we need to get, let's say, good, clear advice from economists about the likely costs and the likely magnitudes of certain courses of action. And then, as with every big decision in a democracy, then our elected representatives have to weigh those costs and benefits on our behalf. And, unfortunately, in the last couple of decades, we've been exposed to so much nonsense about using economic modelling to make the right decisions on everything from taxes and wages to free trade agreements. What we're going to have to do is be very honest with each other and very honest with ourselves and say, there's no economic model that can tell us exactly what's going to happen. There's no medical model that can tell us exactly what's going to happen. We have to make big decisions in real time that are going to have very real consequences for us in the health domain of our life, in the social domain of our life, and in the economic domain of our life. And I think we all need to cut everybody a bit of slack. We're not trying to optimise here. No one's going to get it perfect here, but we're going to have to make some very big decisions that have very real life and death consequences. and potentially are the most expensive decisions in Australian history. And we're just going to have to make them on the fly with the best available information. So I really hope that we don't politicise the science of coronavirus in the way we politicise the science of climate change. I think we need to admit to each other and to ourselves that reasonable people are going to disagree about the right course of action. But let's not rip the scientists to bits. Let's not play the scientists off against each other. We don't even have to play the economists off against each other. It's just a classic case of getting all the options on the table, hearing debates about them, and then here's the hard bit, making a collective decision and implementing it. We've done that really well so far, but we are only at the very beginning of this crisis.
And there are obviously going to be very real costs associated with the kinds of restrictions that we've implemented, but also globally, if we're entering a period of recession or indeed depression, those things have quite long tails and can impact people's lives sometimes for the rest of their lives. And I guess we're going to have to start having a conversation about how we come out the other side of this and what those options look like, as you said. But I do wonder, do you think that if we were to put together a Venn diagram of economists and commentators who subscribe to this idea that the cure is worse than the disease, and the commentators who think harsh austerity measures will be required to pay down the debt post-crisis, do you think that would look like a circle, or do you think some of these people are going to be in different camps?
Look, it's a great question. I think there'll be some overlap, but I don't think it'll be perfect. I think there'll be, early on there was certainly a lot of overlap between the sort of climate denial and COVID-19 denial. But I think as things evolve, those categories are going to become a bit more fluid and a bit more complicated. But I do think that there is a pride in many economists, and that is the pride of being hard-headed, the pride of being willing to take on the chin that there are winners and losers, and that there are always opportunity costs, and that some people have to pay. Now, there's an honesty to that, and I appreciate that honesty. But I think if we're going to be that hard-headed in our evaluation of coronavirus, then I would implore all of those economists that are urging us to be hard-headed on coronavirus to be just as hard-headed when it comes to our decisions, for example, to ignore domestic violence in the way that we have, or ignore the benefits of spending a lot more money on foreign aid. So I guess hard-headed is one thing, but picking your battles is another thing. And I'd really call on those people that are allegedly so determined to be hard-headed when it comes to sacrificing some older Australians in the name of the common good. I'd like to see them next time we have a hard-headed debate about, whether the Catholic Church should pay tax, or whether we should spend a lot more money on addressing Indigenous disadvantage, because we could do with some hard-headed honesty when it comes to those debates as well. And for decades, I've heard quite a lot of strategic silence from some of these hardheads.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for that chat. That was perhaps has restored my faith in some economists.
Well, and all I can say is wash your hands, Ebony. Just wash your hands. It's look, just on that, I mean, it's amazing that what we've found is the biggest crisis of our time, and the only solutions to it are behaviour change. They're cultural change. No one's out there saying we need a coronavirus hand-washing tax, or a virus trading scheme, or any of the complicated economic instruments that we've been told are so important and so fancy. The only way, the only technology we have to fight this virus is behaviour change and culture change. And of course, behaviour change and culture change would be a wonderful way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and a wonderful way to reduce income inequality, and a wonderful way to change the way so many of our social problems are looked at. So it's important to realise how little economics has had to say about what to do with this crisis of our time. It's just us as individuals that need to change things we do. It's the only defence we have, and no taxes or subsidies or really regulations are even needed to do it. We just need to pull together as a community and behave differently.
Indeed. No carryover credits for hand washing from last flu season.
Boom, boom.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for your time.
Thanks, Eb.
This has been a special episode of Follow the Money, and we're aiming to bring you shorter but more frequent episodes during the pandemic, so please stay tuned and make sure you're subscribed. Check out the Australia Institute's Economics of a Pandemic webinar series at our website, and the next event is on Wednesday the 15th of April at 11 a.m, and it's on the role of artists and the arts in rescuing the economy, with special guests Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, playwright and author Melanie Tate, and Richard Dennis, who you've just heard. It's free, but registration is essential, so check that out at our website at tai.org.au/webinars. For the latest health information, check health.gov.au or listen to the ABC's excellent CoronaCast podcast, which comes out daily. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 14th of April 2020, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit tai.org.au for all our latest research, and please go back and check out Richard's two excellent essays, Spreadsheets of Power from April 2015 and What the Government Thinks You're Worth from the February 2019 editions of The Monthly, and those are at themonthly.com.au. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T, and Richard Dennis is at RDNS_TAI. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macey. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeat from Pulse and Thrum, and you can find more of his music at pulseandthrum.com. Stay home, and thanks for listening.